The Economic, Political, and Social Impact of the Transatlantic Slave Trade on Africa by Babacar Mbaye. Abstract. The transatlantic slave trade radically impaired Africa's potential to develop economically and maintain its social and political stability. The arrival of Europeans on the West African coast and their establishment of slave ports in various parts of the continent triggered a continuous process of exploitation of Africans' human resources, labor, and commodities. This exploitative commerce influenced the African political and religious aristocracies, the warrior classes, and the biracial elite, who made small gains from the slave trade to participate in the oppression of their own people. The Europeans, on the other hand, greatly benefited from the transatlantic slave trade, since it allowed them to amass the raw materials that fed the Industrial Revolution to the detriment of African societies, whose capacity to transform their modes of production into a viable entrepreneurial economy was severely halted. Between the 16th and the 19th century, millions of Africans were forcibly sold and transported to Europe and the Americas as slaves. Known as the Atlantic slave trade, hereafter the Atlantic slave trade or the Atlantic commerce, the forced auction and relocation of Africans into Europe and the Americas was part of a global economic enterprise that lasted from the 1440s to the 1860s. This commerce spread from the western coast of Africa to the rest of the continent, winding its course from the islands of Kore or Gori and St. Louis in current Senegal to Quelimane in present Mozambique. The Atlantic trade affected the lives of millions of Africans who came from such diverse regions such as Senegambia, Sierra Leone, West Central Africa, Southeast Africa, and the Bight of Benin, the Gold Coast, and the Bight of Biafra. While the effects of the Atlantic trade on the enslaved Africans have been partly documented, those on the non-enslaved Africans remain largely unknown. The trade brought about enduring insecurities, economic chaos, and political disorders in Africa. It arrested its development by exploiting its technological, agricultural, and cultural skills for the development of the West only. It hampered Africa's mercantilist economy by halting its capacity to be transformed into a capitalist economy. Moreover, it started the systematic and continuous process of economic exploitation and social and political fragmentation that Europeans later institutionalized through colonization and neo-colonization. Furthermore, the Atlantic trade led to the transformation of semi-feudal classes in Africa that collaborated with Europeans to sanction the oppression of their own people. These classes came from the African aristocracy and middlemen who facilitated the capture and sale of Africans and made substantial gains from the trade. Yet, despite these gains, Europeans, not only Africans, benefited from the trade the most. Europeans received from the trade unprecedented human labor and economic capital that allowed them to develop their societies at the expense of Africa. Historical background. The Atlantic slave trade was initially a small commercial system based on the exchange of African material or human capital, such as gold or slaves, with few European material goods, such as guns and silk. By the end of the 16th century, this trade became a large market that promoted the barbaric capture and transportation of millions of Africans to the Americas. The commerce started in 1441, when 10 Africans were taken from the Mauritian coast and shipped to Lisbon. 3 years later, 240 Africans from the same coast were brought to Lisbon. It is often said that Europeans did not begin the Atlantic trade and that they only tapped into a human trade that already existed in Africa. While domestic forms of slavery and the trans-Saharan slave trade existed in Africa prior to the arrival of the Europeans in the 1400s, these had a lesser impact on the continent than did the Atlantic trade. The latter surpassed the earlier trade in terms of the immeasurable loss of lives and resources it brought about in Africa and the Black diaspora. Three forms of slavery relegated Africans to an inferior social status and deprived them, partially or wholly, of their freedom. They legitimized the removal of Africans from their homeland and their relocation in foreign territories. Yet the Atlantic trade differed from African slavery and Arab slavery because it was founded on a unique and rigid concept of bondage. Unlike the Arabs and Africans, Europeans had a theory of slavery in which conversion to the religion of the master or marriage with the master did not prevent a person and his or her descendants from inheriting the status of slave. Despite this fundamental difference, these forms of slavery complemented each other because the slave markets that Europeans established in Africa developed out of the earlier Arab and African trades. The Portuguese, whose navigation system was better than those of any European empire of the 1400s, traded in African gold, ivory, gum, hide, wax, and slaves, which the Arabs had dominated for centuries. By the end of the 15th century, the Portuguese had total control over this commerce. As Basil Davidson documents, by about 1506, Duarte Pacheco Pereira is writing that the goods exchanged at Argium and elsewhere consist of gold, black slaves, oryx leather, or for shields and other items against Portuguese red and blue stuffs and various textiles, both poor and good quality, as well as horses. This anticipates Philip D. Curtin's argument that the Africans received from European traders more than worthless goods such as cheap gewgaws, beads, rums, and firearms. According to Curtin, African importation of European textile increased from 28.2% in 1730 to 58.9% in 1830, before plummeting to 4% in 1860, casting doubt on the role Africa played in the development of European export products before the 19th century. Joseph Inikori, however, questions the credibility of the Inspector General's ledgers of imports and exports of Great Britain, on which Curtin based his study of the yearly value of commodity exports for Britain to the African coast from 1797 to 1808. Any calculations of British slave exports based on these figures of commodity exports will, if of necessity, underestimate the quantity of slaves exported because, in the first place, a large proportion of the goods employed in the purchase of slaves on the African coast by British citizens were taken from ports outside Britain and were therefore not included in the Inspector General's accounts. In the second place, the latter accounts have been found seriously to underestimate both the volume and value of goods exported from Britain to Africa and elsewhere. Inikori suggests that Britain's economy made substantial profit from the Atlantic trade and, specifically, from the importation of African slaves. Anticipating Inikori's thesis, Eric Williams pointed out that England was devastated when the 13 American colonies announced in 1783 their withdrawal from its control, fearing that independence would lead to the collapse of its economy by removing its manufacturers from American markets. Therefore, in July 1783, the British Order in Council decreed a treaty with the colonies that allowed England to import slaves from its former U.S. colonies. The effect was a catastrophic 50% increase in British imports from North America between 1784 and 1790. Meanwhile, the English had secured their ongoing importation of slaves from Africa at unbeatable prices. Between 1680 and the 1730s, the price of a slave on the African slave coast rose from £3 to £10 between 1700 and 1790. So £10. And between 1700 and 1790, England imported 10 billion cowrie shells for the use on the coast and spent only £1 for 2,000 shells. Consequently, the African population taken to the British colonies in the West Indies grew drastically, as Williams notes. With free trade and the increasing demands of the sugar plantations, the volume of British slave trade rose enormously. The Royal African Company between 1680 and 1686 transported an annual average of 5,000 slaves. In the first 9 years of free trade, Bristol alone shipped 160,950 black people to the sugar plantations. In 1760, 146 ships sailed from British ports for Africa, with a capacity for 36,000 slaves. In 1771, the number of ships had increased to 190, and the number of slaves to 47,000. The importation into Jamaica from 1700 to 1786 was 610,000, and it has been estimated that the total import of slaves into all the British colonies between 1680 and 1786 was over 2 million. These statistics are among the most quoted estimates of the number of slaves that were brought to the United States and to the Caribbean from the 16th to the 19th century. The disparity between the number of slaves who embarked from Africa and of those who disembarked in the Caribbean, the United States, and Brazil between 1580 and 1840 is shown in the following. The Caribbean, slaves embarked from Africa, 4 billion? I think that's 4 billion. No, sorry, it's 4 million. So 4,84,565 slaves disembarked in the Caribbean. 3,446,600. The United States, slaves embarked from Africa. 317,748. Slaves disembarked in the United States. 270,976. Brazil, slaves embarked from Africa, 1,308,479. Slaves disembarked in Brazil, 1,165,366. These numbers derive from Curtin, who argues that nearly 9.4 million Africans were enslaved in the Americas, while about 175,000 were brought to Europe and the African Atlantic islands. Corroborating Curtin's assessment, Postma adds that, allowing for an estimated 12 to 15% mortality rate during the Atlantic crossing, approximately 11 million must have been shipped from Africa. Some scholars believed that Curtin's figures were too low, but more and more data were collected. New estimations deviated only slightly. Inikori, one of Curtin's critics, argues that they resulted from unspecified bias on Curtin's part and that a more accurate count would be just over 15 million. While he recognizes that scholars have contested the global figure of 15.4 million, Inikori admits that the ultimate figure is unlikely to be less than 12 million or more than 20 million captives exported from Africa in the transatlantic slave trade. The divergence between Curtin's and Inikori's estimations epitomizes the differences in the interpretation of the history of the Atlantic trade. For example, according to David Henage, Louis-Marie Diop-Maes argues that the population of Africa on the eve of the slave trade was as great as 270 million, and that such a dense population must have been predicated on agro-technological capabilities on a par with those of Europe at the time. Diop believes that the slave trade involved a loss on the order of 100 million persons, double Inikori's estimate. She rejects the theory that disease and famine took the lives of more Africans than the slave trade did. Disproving this theory, Diop argues that 1. The evidence of the exported number of slaves and that of the multiple kidnappings, raids, contradict the notion that there were 4 to 5 inhabitants in Africa in every kilometer squared, or every square kilometer. 2. The population density of Africa during the 15th and 16th centuries was at least 15 to 20 inhabitants per squared kilometer for a total population of 300 to 400 million people. The idea of underpopulation must be abandoned because even the population density of Europe was about 10 inhabitants per square Columita, from the 15th to the 17th centuries. 4. In the late 15th and early 16th centuries, better climate and sophisticated pre-industrial economy supported the lives of 600 to 800 million Africans with an average population density of 30 to 40 inhabitants per kilometer squared. Diop's thesis suggests that Africa was not underdeveloped at the beginning of the Atlantic trade. Its populations had demographical, climatological, and agricultural conditions that allowed them to develop their own contexts. Recognizing this fact requires us to remove the notion of development from the capitalist framework in which it is commonly understood. Walter Rodney describes this capitalistic framework as the correlation of economic development with factors of production, such as land, production, capital, technology, specialization, and large-scale production. For Rodney, these factors are limited because they do not mention the exploitation of the majority which underlay all development prior to socialism. The way that factors and relations of production combine to form a distinctive system or mode of production varying from one historical epoch to another, and the manner in which imperialism is a logical phase of capitalism. Thus, assessing the level of Africa's development at the time of the trade requires us to subtract the inestimable consequences of slavery, imperialism, and colonialism on its economic, social, and political development. Economic impacts. Africa did not play a secondary role in the Atlantic trade system. Africans dominated the local commerce of resin, orchil, gold, spices, cattle, and people before the Europeans arrived, proving that Europeans' political and commercial powers on the Atlantic coast were far less important than historians assume. Thornton comments on the high purchasing power of West Africans in 1650, when, in search of fancy and variety, 1.5 million Senegambians imported 1,200 tons of iron for 300,000 households, and in 1680 needed 300 tons of iron a year just for their households. Since the Portuguese brought little iron to Africa, where else but in Africa could they get it? In other words, Africans were economically self-sufficient and socially stable when Europeans came to trade with them. Thornton points out that the Atlantic trade of Africa was not simply motivated by the filling of basic needs, and the propensity to import on the part of Africans was not simply a measure of their need or inefficiency, but instead it was a measure of the extent of their domestic market. Yet, within less than a century of commerce with the Western world, Africa lost both its economic autonomy and social peace, becoming a land where local states, chiefs, and warlords allied with insatiable European traders to oppress the vulnerable populations they captured. As Inikori argues, the European demand for more and more captives soon gave rise to the formation of groups and bandits all over Western Africa. In places where the foundations already laid had not yet given rise to firmly established large political organization, the process was hijacked by these bandits. Overall, the conditions created by the large-scale European demand for captives over a period of more than 300 years severely retarded the long-term process of socio-economic development in Western Africa. The disruption of Africa's political structures and socio-economic potentials was part of the stagnation of Africa's technological progress caused by the slave trade. As Rodney has shown, the trade affected Africa's economy by bringing about a loss of industry, skills, technological invention, and production of Africans. On the one hand, Rodney argues that what Africa experienced in the early centuries of the trade was precisely a loss of development opportunity, that is, the ability to achieve the self-sustaining growth and progress that its enslaved young population could have secured. On the other hand, he contends that the trade took away opportunity by disorienting the purpose of African traders. In Africa, the trading groups could make no contribution to technological improvement because their role and preoccupation took their minds and energies away from production. By contrast, the trade benefited the West by developing its technology with the important with the importation of skilled Africans of all ages. This importation marked the beginning of Africa's brain drain that continues to hamper development in the continent. The economic impact of the Atlantic slave trade on Africa varied according to time and geographic context. The Senegambia, including the Senegal and the Gambia rivers, was the first sub-Saharan region the Portuguese encountered in the 1460s. Here, the Portuguese settled in the Cabo Verde Island and the James Island and intermarried with neighboring Africans who later became invaluable suppliers of local goods. For most of the 15th century, the Portuguese traded in gold from the Banbuk goldfields of the Gambia-Senegal hinterlands, hides from the savannah cattle herders, and other local products, along with slaves who came both from the coast and from the savannas of the upper Niger interior. Africans from the interior traded in European products such as iron, cotton, mats, and textiles. In return, the Africans received products such as guns, liquor, beads, mirrors, and some slaves. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the Atlantic commerce started to have profound effects on the size of the African population that was rapidly decreasing. Between 1450 and 1850, in rough terms, over 11.5 million people were exported from the Atlantic coast of Africa, nearly 10 million of whom arrived in the New World. The trade, according to Inikori, had substantial economic impact on the local African economies. It is generally accepted that the export centers on the African coast benefited economically and demographically from the trade. Where they succeeded in insulating themselves from the socio-political upheavals provoked by the trade in their hinterlands, these port towns or city-states realized short-term benefits that have been equated with private gains. Market production of agricultural commodities to meet the limited needs of the slave ships for foodstuffs was stimulated. Their populations expanded as the coastal traders retained some of the captives for their business needs and for the production of their subsistence products, and so on. These port towns or city-states typically grew as enclave economies. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the Europeans brought retail goods to local African markets, such as those in the Gori Island in Senegal, Elmina in Ghana, and Alada and Waida in the former kingdom of Dahomey, today called Benin, and further inland. The Dutch created the Gori slave house in 1776, many years after the English first built the James Fort in James Island in the Gambia, 1661. The Elmina Castle was a major commercial base established by the Portuguese in Elmina, Ghana, in 1482. The Dutch constructed the slave fort in Alada early in the 17th century, while the French built the fort in Waida in 1671. European goods, silks, linen, handkerchiefs, Indian cloths, and china became available not only to African dignitaries, but also to the population at large, as long as they could afford the price. These goods became more abundant as the trade progressed and became cheaper. In this respect, Africa was not a passive participant in the slave trade. Thornton criticizes French analysts, such as Ferdinand Brudel and Pierre and Hugo Chodnau. I don't really mind mispronouncing European people, they're part of the problem. Anyway, who claimed that Africa did not make substantial contributions to the development of the Atlantic world. Refuting this Eurocentric assumption, Thornton shows that Africa's long-held maritime and international commercial culture along the Egyptian Nile, the Nile of Sudan, the Niger, and the Senegal River had given the continent autonomy, experience, and economic power that predated the Atlantic commerce and which later dictated its rules and regulations. Klein confirms Thornton's argument. Long-term contact with the Islamic states in North Africa and the Near East, and even long-distance trade between Asia and East Africa prior to the arrival of the Europeans meant that Africans could negotiate from a reasonable knowledge of international markets what items of European or even Asian production most appealed to them. While it shows the sophisticated level of the African commercial system at the beginning of the trade, Klein's statement, like Thornton's, conjures up the troubling yet inevitable notion that some Africans used their genius to profit from a trade of inhuman beings. The controversial idea that the African economy profited from the slave trade often centers on Klein's logical question. If Africans were definitely not passive economic actors, what about the price they received for their slaves? Klein's query introduces the economic dimensions of the trade, which, when considered, show how the trade was ultimately detrimental to Africa, no matter what pittance local African merchants received from it. It was Europeans, not Africans, who eventually benefited from the trade. Donald Wright provides astounding statistics on the financial gains made from African slaves in the pound sterling currency. In the 1600s, specifically the 1680s, one healthy adult slave cost an English buyer an average of 5.47 pounds, but that price rose gradually to 9.43 pounds in the 1720s and 10.05 pounds in the 1740s, then 14.10 pounds in the 1760s and 20.95 pounds in the 1780s. Profit is evident in prices for slaves in the American market. A healthy adult slave in Virginia in 1690 brought 15 pounds in 1760. And then in 1760, 45 pounds, right? That was weird. Don't know why I was unable to read that. Another factor that suggests that the Atlantic trade had negative impacts on Africa's economy was the prevalence of European and African raiding, capture, and torture of Africans from the coasts and the hinterlands. These disruptions prevented Africans who were not involved in the trade from doing business in peace and security without the threat of being kidnapped and sold to Europeans, as Inikori indicates. It is difficult for many studying the slave trade to imagine any kind of economic growth under the conditions of violence and insecurity that the trade promoted. It is equally impossible to presume that Africa's economy could have remained developed during a brutal period when it was increasingly based solely on the sale of slaves, as Davidson explains. After about 1650, with diminishing expectations, African production for export became a monoculture in human beings. This can be seen to have suffocated economic growth in coastal and near-coastal Africa as surely as the extension of European production for export of consumer goods gave maritime nations of Europe, at the same time, their long lead in economic development. The metaphor of suffocation is appropriate. The trade stifled the continent's technological and commercial potentials, preventing Africans from being on the same economic level, the playing field, where they would have been had the Europeans not exploited them so viciously and for so long. Had history unfolded differently, Africans would have realized that the trade was going to benefit Europeans only. They would have collectively and radically opposed the trade in all of its forms. Political impacts. The political impact of the Atlantic trade is visible in the changes it wrought in African societies. It subverted the existing political balance in traditional African societies. Since slavery became a dominant source of revenue in the continent, personal wealth was thought to derive from one's ability to help capture and sell one's neighbors or criminals to strangers. As a consequence, the scenario Europeans created became a Darwinian universe in which the African turned into a wolf, preying on other Africans. James Searing argues that in the 1770s, the king of the Guise dynasty organized several grand pillages in the Kajur and Bawol kingdoms in northwestern and central Senegal, kidnapping slaves who were later sold to the Europeans on the Guri Island. Likewise, the territories of the Konaiguai and the Basari in eastern Senegal were preserves for slave hunt, before they became the main suppliers of slaves for Europeans to the detriment of the Diola, Manjakwe, and other populations who settled by the rivers of the south. These raids resulted from clashes among Africans, spurred by growing European competition in the continent. Martin Klein sees the increase in raids in Senegambia as the effect of the newly introduced cultivation of peanuts in the 1830s, and cites an Englishman's account. As soon as each Senegambian has been able to purchase a horse and a gun, he considers himself a warrior, lives by plunder, and works his field by the slaves he captures in his expeditions, and thinks it is beneath his dignity to perform any work whatsoever, which is left to women and slaves. This suggests the violence, chauvinism, and classism that resulted from the new forms of social and economic relationships centered on the combination of slave ownership and peanut production. Unlike slave ownership, peanut production was new to the continent. The Portuguese had introduced groundnuts to Africa in the 16th century in the Upper Guinea coast. They probably learned to cultivate the vegetable from the South American Indians since, as George Brooks argues, the plant existed there before Columbus traveled to this hemisphere. Yet it was from Africa that peanuts were later introduced into North America by way of the West Indies during the Atlantic trade. Before 1830, the cultivation of peanuts in Africa was minimal and mainly served to feed horses. Yet, as Brooks suggests, peanuts came to be grown in the drier areas of the Senegambia as a safeguard against failure of the millet harvest, and along the coast to the southwards as a subsidiary food crop of marginal, though increasing, consequence. Between 1830 and 1840, the production of peanuts increased dramatically as the British, French, Portuguese, and African chiefs competed in a lucrative market in which slaves and peanuts paid the highest price for its cultivation and sale. Spurred by European and Euro-African coastal traders, African agriculturalists opportunistically responded to the new market opportunities with remarkable swiftness. Wherever peanut production spread, it occasioned far-reaching economic and social changes for the African societies concerned. A major impact of the introduction of this crop was the drop in millet production, formerly a staple food and commercial product. Focusing on the upper basin of the Senegal River, where the Galam kingdom used to be, the Senegalese historian and political leader Abdoulaye Bathily argues that millet was a primary foodstuff for the inhabitants of the empire and a major part of the economic history of the region during the 18th century. In 1720, 1731, 1737, 1744, 1755, and 1754, both the inhabitants of Galam and those of the French ports in the territory suffered from millet shortages due to a series of raids from the Moors and from the Kaaso and the Bambuko kingdoms that were rivaling Galam. Part of this crisis derived from a climate change that resulted in poor agricultural yields and famines. While Bathily believes that it would be vain and false to claim that natural calamities such as drought, inundations, locust invasions, and epidemics are the determining factors that led to famine and food shortages in Senegambia during the 17th and 18th centuries, Charles Becker argues that some natural factors affected the living conditions in that region. Yet, as Becker suggests, raids, wars, and migrations created more food crises and death in Senegambia than did climate factors, arising primarily from the raids that the peanut rush encouraged among the Wolof states, which was so detrimental for the more reliable and nourishing cultivation of millet. As a result, the Wolof states became dependent on a staple that was mainly designed for Western consumption. According to Brooks, Alan McPhee described the trade in peanuts and palm oil before the mid-19th century as a reflex action of the Industrial Revolution and a consequence of the growing demand in industrializing countries for oils and fats of all kind. Another predicament arising from peanut cultivation in Senegambia was the formation of a feudal class that developed on a lower class that produced or collected peanuts and Arabic gums. The French, who had promoted the systematic oppression in Senegambia later sought to fight it by giving slaves who had escaped from the African empires the opportunity to declare their freedom once they reached their forts. The irony was that the planter-slave relationship that the French had promoted among the African chiefs was so solid that it became integrated even in societies that were fighting for the spread of Islam. Klein gives the example of Jaco, or Jacho, or Maba Diakoba, the king of Saloum in west-central Senegal, who tried to convert the Sera people of Sine and encouraged the enslavement and execution of pagans or their exploitation as peanut farmers. When Maba died in 1876, his lieutenants were primarily slave raiders. Continuous raids in Africa after the abolition of slavery in the West were due to the feudal and anarchic class relationships that the Atlantic trade had promoted. In this sense, as Searing points out, slavery among Wolof states was linked to the rise of aristocratic power, but also contributed to a process of peasantization, and thereby reinforced the social groups who had come to oppose the aristocracy. The attempt of the aristocracy to create a regime based on slavery was never entirely successful, and slavery was only one form of dependency in a regime that also exhibited seigneurial features. Yeah, that word. Seigneurial. Pinned comment or something. Seigneurial features. If you're listening to this, I'll make a comment. Say, what is this? Anyway, in Senegambia too, slave ownership had a political function that added to the African kings' dominance of the peasantry. It allowed kings to impose their hegemony on surrounding kings and provided them with ways to procure individuals to sell to Europeans. Discussing slave raiding in Kajur, Senegal in the 1770s, Searing writes, "State violence served the interests of the monarchy in several ways. Slaves sales paid for military expeditions by providing revenues to purchase guns and horses, which were needed to defend dynastic interests, to intimidate villages enough to ensure tribute payments, and to keep foreign military predators at bay. If slave raids eliminated or weakened independent populations who refused to pay tribute, they also contributed to the state's broader effort to tax the population. In spite of its brutality, the state was weak and used naked force to support its authority." This suggests that slave raiding did not evolve out of the Kajur chiefs' reckless use of force, but from their calculated strategy to resist domination and strengthen their position in a highly unstable and economically competitive region. Thus, it resulted from new traumatic human and economic relations imposed by the slave trade as much as from differentiations between Africans on grounds of caste, class, or creed. Another negative impact the Atlantic trade had on the political life of Africans was the formation of a pseudo-feudal class which Europeans created in major slave islands after their intermarriage with some Africans. In the 4 Senegalese regions, then called Les Quartiers Communes, including Gori, Dakar, Rafusik, and Saint Louis, a new Afro-French class, the Métisses or Mulâtres, see if a friend who knows French comments and says something, it's okay, emerged at the top of a local political hierarchy that included local mayors, subordinates, and slave soldiers. This hierarchy of corrupt individuals facilitated the slave and economic policy of the French in the country. The stratum was maintained by an Afro-French upper class that organized the capture, stockage, and sale of slaves. According to Inikori, historians such as Claude Melesso, Martin Klein, and Paul Lovejoy have argued that such small-sized geographic areas dominated by corrupt political and military aristocracies led to the creations of African societies that were inimical to capitalist development. Inikori also notes that the emergence during the 19th century of a slave warrior class in Senegal, the Kedo, which brought about such widespread insecurity and exploitation that even the Muslim leadership in West and East Africa could not subdue. This Islamic alternative, intended to contain the disruptive effects of the Atlantic trade, was soon caught up in the vicious circle of the forces it sought to control and ended up depending on slaving for survival. This allows us to introduce Lovejoy's transformation thesis, which holds that warfare, political fragmentation, and dependency became endemic in Africa as a result of the massive scale of the slave trade forced upon Africans by commercial and military pressures. The external demand for slaves and the rivalry between African states directly affected the spread of slavery, for both caused tensions that led to the enslavement of people. The economy became dependent upon exports to satisfy the personal desires of merchants and rulers and to provide many parts of Africa with a money supply, textiles, firearms, and other goods that were essential to the economy and political rule. The fragmented political structure, reinforced by military purchases and the need to acquire slaves to finance imports, was related to a general state of insecurity that facilitated enslavement. These two conditions, the slave market and institutionalized enslavement, set the stage for the extension of slavery in Africa. Lovejoy illustrates this process with the examples of the Songhai, Borno, and Congo empires, in which increasing interest in slave raids and trade and continuous political fragmentation led to collapse. Before the 19th century, Songhai was the largest state in Africa, yet in 1951, a Moroccan army crossed the Sahara and invaded it. The empire was so decentralized that it was unable to consolidate political power to resist the invasion. As a result of its vulnerability, the Songhai Empire fell into a state of confusion and political instability. A familiar downfall occurred in the state of Borno in the sub-Saharan region, which was actively engaged in slave raiding to finance its trade with the Ottoman Empire in North Africa. Borno hoped that this alliance would grant it legitimate hegemony south of the Sahara. Borno's policy produced adverse effects such as increasing slave raiding and limiting conversion to Islam. Along the west coast, rivalries between Congo, Oyo, the Gold Coast, and Guinea shores brought about increasing political disintegration and small-scale states. Between 1650 and 1750, two larger states emerged in the coastal zone, Oyo after 1650 and Asante after 1700, but they were never very large. The root cause of the downfall of these states was the expansion of empire through war and slavery, instigated by the European Atlantic trade. Social impacts. The question of the social impact of the Atlantic trade on Africa is difficult to tackle because it is here that intense emotions and the weight of collective memory press most heavily. Contemporary Africans are constantly told that the present state of their societies derive from their ugly and savage participation in the slave trade. While some historians have approached the matter objectively, others have merely reiterated the myth of African savagery. Curtin explains the historical misconceptions that underlie the denigration of Africa. Some historians have been too willing to accept and to interweave into their own specific research some of the assumptions earlier Europeans have made about Africa, usually without research. Among these was the belief that African economies must have been static. It follows from the myth of a savage, and it led to the assumption of African weakness and perhaps inherent inferiority. These misconceptions are reinforced by stereotypes that go so far as to question the very humanity of Africans. Oliver Ransford develops the eugenicist theory that the trade deprived the continent of its most valuable genes. As a result, for generations of Negro Africa lay dazed, helpless, and exhausted. He continues, as a legacy to their descendants, they, Africans, left no benefits or improvements, but merely a traditional belief that it was cleverer to get rich quickly than to work hard. Today, easy money is still regarded with approval on the coast. But the greatest insult is the following. The manhunt which raged through Africa bred and sustained intertribal hostility and so contributed to the present-day instability of the continent's internal relationships. The wars fomented by slaves also unmasked the demon of brutality which lurks in the background of the Negro soul no less than it haunts the white men's. For centuries it knew no moral censor and burst out of control. The Africans' dark obsession with death and evil spirits, their grotesque and awful superstitions, the macabre humor and relish with which they explored the depths of other people's fears and torments, were all now released and given full rein. Even today, one sometimes sees among Africans a feeling that they regard such evil passions as meteorous and healing, and in this context we may recall the screaming theme of the modern black militants, whose flavors was so clearly projected by Frantz Fanon when he preached that violence is a cleansing force. Clearly, Ransford is misinformed. The present political and social problems that confront Africa have nothing to do with any biological, psychological, behavioral, or spiritual characteristics or values of Africans. The roots of the predicament facing Africa are in the structural, economic, and political disruptions that the continent inherited from the European slavers and colonizers. The African societies have difficulty in advancing their economic development because the constitutions that they inherited from European powers do not reflect the structural realities of their societies. Instead of understanding Africa's problems in the context of its history, Ransford makes the fatal mistake of confusing colonization with pre-colonization. The militant theme of violence that Fanon preached was an intellectual commitment that he sought to rid Africa of colonial exploitation, not to subject her to it. Fanon never celebrated violence of Africans against Africans. However, there is no doubt that the slave trade created tremendous social problems in Africa, and that these problems have drastic effects on its current realities. Surely, the demography of Africa was greatly affected by the unprecedented transportation of African populations to foreign lands. As Klein points out, it is argued that the population of Western Africa actually declined by 2 million between 1700 and 1850. The estimate is that the Western African population declined from a projected 25 million to 23 million in its 150-year period. Had the population grown to a conservative 0.3% per annum in the same period, it would have reached 39.3 million in 1850. In addition, as shown earlier, a dominant factor in the enslavement of Africans was the participation of some Africans in the trade. In their response to European demands, some Africans created social systems of production that proved to be beneficial to whites and detrimental to blacks. Claude Millioux shows that these systems were founded on a constant and permanent transfer of human beings within a four-dimensional, organic, and economic space. The societies within which slaves were captured, which represent the milieu in which they were produced demographically and economically, the aristocratic slave-owning societies which made use of a military apparatus to tear these human beings from the milieu in which they were produced and reproduced, the merchant societies which controlled the commercial apparatus necessary for the sale of captives, and the merchant societies which were consumers of slaves. The irony is that these social networks, traditionally based on legality and respect toward the individual domestic slave, later became tyrannical systems of kidnapping vulnerable individuals during the 18th and 19th centuries. By abducting and selling Africans to Europeans, the African social networks, supported by African political leaders, became agents of tyranny and social insecurity against Africans. This sense of insecurity finds expression in Oladuwa Equiano's memory from his childhood in Benin, Nigeria. One day, when all our people were gone out to their works as usual, and only I and my dear sister were left to mind the house, 2 men and a woman got over our walls, and in a moment seized us both. and without giving us any time to cry out or make resistance, they stopped our mouths and ran off with us into the nearest wood. Another social effect of the trade was the widening gap between social classes. Inikori has argued that the trade produced islands of growth and prosperity that contrasted sharply with the misery and poverty of the raided populations. Once slave ownership became the basis of economic success, it became quite impossible for poor Africans to achieve success. Only the brave and corrupted individuals such as the slave warriors could profit from it. For example, the dynastic factions in the principal African states of the agricultural regions south of Senegal River, Kajur, Bawol, Walo, became dependent on slave warriors for the power they exercised. The sexual demography of the continent also changed as a result of the trade. By comparing the percentage of male and female slaves landed in the West Indies between 1781 and 1798, Inikori found that the number of females annually exported was of a magnitude that must have drastically reduced the region's capacity. Strong evidence supports Inikori's thesis. Claire C. Robertson and Martin A. Klein have shown that in Mombasa and in the Upper Zaire, female slaves used to do as much work as free women. They grew indigo, made dye, and helped their mistress with dyeing cloth. When the trade took most of the men away, women slaves were asked to take their jobs. Thornton cites Lemos Colho, a Portuguese traveler, on the roles of slave women in the Bissago Islands in the late 17th century. They are the ones who work the fields and plant the crops, and the houses in which they live, even though small, are clean and bright, and despite all this work, they still go down to the sea each day and to catch shellfish. Thornton explains that, because of the established institution of polygamy, the most undiminished numbers of women were able to counterbalance some of the losses to the slave trade by continued reproduction. Thornton points to the important role of keepers of their communities that African women played not just in the continent but also in the Western world, where many of them had been enslaved with African men and children whose full stories remain to be told. Conclusion. The Atlantic slave trade had drastic impacts on African societies. Initially conceived by both Europeans and Africans as a small-scale enterprise for the exchange of goods and a few slaves, it later became a ruthless and demonic machine that drained Africa's human and economic resources. By massively responding to Europe's growing demand for slaves, African societies started up a commercial process that progressively hampered their economic, political, and social developments. The trade inflated Africa's economy by reducing it to a monoculture based on the sale of human beings. As a result, the once strong and developed African states lost their stability and became fragmented by internal and external conflicts that still affect the continent today. Surely the current economic and social problems that plague contemporary Africa have their roots in the Atlantic trade. The unprecedented violence among African societies, ethnic groups, and states, and the subversion of social and gender roles which resulted from such anarchy would never have taken place had the Atlantic trade, followed by imperialism and colonialism, not taken root in Africa. What therefore needs to be taken into account in the study of the Atlantic slave trade is the force of these historical circumstances and not the so-called evil nature of the African.